Welcome to A World Beyond War or No World at All with David Swanson. I'm Don Dillard. I'll be your host tonight, and I want to say a couple of thank yous. Hadi Jawad did the vast majority of the work, maybe almost 100% of the work of putting this together. Aftad Siddiqui has been the chair of the North Texas Peace Advocates, and that's who's putting this on tonight. I'm Don Dillard, and I hope you will mute yourself as so we can not have all that background noise and all, and that we hope to have between 30 and 45 minutes of lecturing content, and then we'll go to the questions, and hopefully you can put your questions in the chat section. And so without further ado, let me introduce David Swanson. He was born in 1969, is an American anti-war activist, blogger, and author, and currently resides in Virginia. And he is the executive director of, I don't have what that is. Oh, excuse me. Sorry for that. I think I'm sorry. Don't have that.
World Beyond War.
World Beyond War. He has a Master of Philosophy from the University of Virginia, and is an author of several books: Daybreak, Undoing the Imperial Presidency and Forming a More Perfect Union, War is a Lie, When the World Outlawed War, and War No More, The Case for Abolition. Swanson is the host of a radio show on the Talk Nation Radio. Welcome, and we're glad to have you.
Thank you very, very much. Sounded like that might have come from Wikipedia and was nonetheless.
Was it wrong?
Oh, no, it was remarkably close to the truth, despite having come from Wikipedia. So yes. Very good. Thanks for having me. I've drafted some words that I'll read, and then I hope we can have lots of discussion and questions and corrections and objections. So, in a world beyond war, death, injury, and trauma from violence would be radically reduced. Homelessness and immigration driven by fear would be largely eliminated. Environmental destruction would slow considerably. Government secrecy would lose all justification. Bigotry would take a huge setback. The world would gain over $2 trillion, and the United States alone, $1.25 trillion every year. The world would be spared several $1 trillion of destruction every year. Governments would gain huge amounts of time and energy to invest in something else. The concentration of wealth and the corruption of elections would suffer significant setbacks. Hollywood movies would find new consultants. Billboards and race cars and pre-game ceremonies would find new sponsors. Flags would be disenchanted. Mass shootings and suicides would suffer serious slowdowns. Police would find different heroes. If you wanted to thank someone for a service, it would have to be for an actual service. The rule of law might become a reality globally. Brutal governments would lose the use of war weaponry domestically and the support of war-mad imperial powers like the US government, which currently arms, funds, and/or trains most governments on Earth, including almost all of the worst ones. Cuba and North Korea, the two exceptions, are too valuable as enemies, and nobody has noticed or cared that the US arms and funds its latest top enemy, China. A world beyond war might move us toward democracy, or a democracy might move us toward a world beyond war. How we get there remains to be seen. But the first step is to realize where we are now. At the organization called World Beyond War, we just finished our annual conference, and there were a lot of terrific discussions. One was the democracy one, in which one person suggests that democracy would bring peace and someone else proves this false by pointing out how war-crazed the Earth's democracies are. This discussion always bothers me because the Earth's national governments do not actually include any democracies. Capitalist economies, yes. Do nations with McDonald's wage war on other nations with McDonald's? Yes, they do. And there are McDonald's in Russia, Ukraine, China, Venezuela, Pakistan, Philippines, Lebanon, and in US bases in Iraq and Cuba. But democracies? How in the hell would anyone know what democracies do? A world beyond war could put up a serious effort to slow the collapse of the climate and ecosystems. A world that does not move beyond war will look like this world we're in. Scientists place the doomsday clock closer to midnight than it's ever been, the risk of nuclear war higher than it's ever been, the expectation of what nuclear war anywhere on the planet would do to the entire planet worse than it's ever been. Russia says it will never get rid of its nukes as long as the United States is threatening and dominating the globe with non-nuclear weapons. Israel's been permitted to acquire but pretend it doesn't have nuclear weapons, and numerous other nations, including Saudi Arabia, seem intent on pursuing that path. The United States is building lots more nukes and talking shamelessly about using them. Much of the world has banned the possession of nuclear weapons, and US activists are dreaming of getting their government's so-called Defense Department merely to say it won't use them first, which raises the question of what an offense department would do differently, and the question of why anyone would believe a statement from the so-called Defense Department, as well as the question of exactly what sort of lunatic would use nuclear weapons second or third. Our luck at avoiding the intentional or accidental use of nukes will not last. And we will only get rid of the nukes if we get rid of war. So we can have a world beyond war, or we can have no world at all. I recently wrote a book debunking misconceptions about World War II, and the lies justifying the nuclear bombings are a major part of those problems. But they are failing so fast that Malcolm Gladwell just published a book substituting the fire bombings of dozens of Japanese cities prior to the nuclear bombings as the supposed necessary evil that saved lives and brought the world peace and prosperity. When this new twist on the propaganda fails, it'll be something else. Because if the mythology surrounding World War II crumbles, so will the whole war machine. So how are we doing at moving beyond war? We had a Congress vote repeatedly to end the war on Yemen when it could count on a Trump veto. Since then, not a peep. We've seen not a single resolution introduced to actually end the war on Afghanistan or any other war, or to close a single base anywhere, or to halt the drone murders. A new president has proposed a larger military budget than ever, intentionally avoided reinstating the Iran agreement, supported the abandonment of treaties illegally dumped by Trump, such as the Open Skies Treaty and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Treaty, upped the hostility with North Korea, doubled down on lies and childish insults toward Russia, and proposed yet more free weapons money for Israel. If a Republican had tried this, there would be at the very least a rally in the street in Dallas, possibly even in Crawford. If a Republican had been president when they resorted to UFOs as a stand-in for the lack of any credible military enemy on Earth, somebody would have at least laughed. Iran spends 1% and Russia 8% of US military spending. China spends 14% of the military spending of the US and its allies and weapons customers, not counting Russia or China. The annual increase in military spending by the US is more than the total military spending of most of its designated enemies. Bombing for peace is in trouble, with polls for years finding the US government in most parts of the world viewed as the top threat to peace. So it may be necessary to bomb people for democracy. Sadly, however, a recent poll found the US government widely considered the top threat to democracy. So there may be a need to bomb little Yemeni and Palestinian children for the rule-based order. This is the new thing you hear about from the president and the Secretary of State, the rule-based order. However, some of us have been searching for the rule-based order and have been unable to find it. It seems not to be written down anywhere. The United States is party to fewer major human rights treaties than almost any other government on earth, is the greatest opponent of international courts, is the greatest abuser of United Nations vetoes, is the greatest weapons dealer, is the greatest imprisoner, is in many ways the greatest destroyer of the Earth's environment, and takes part in the most wars and the most lawless missile murders. The rule-based order seems to require boycotting Chinese Olympics because of how China manufactures products, even while buying those products and arming and funding the Chinese military and collaborating with China on bioweapons labs. Under the rule-based order, one must save the South China Sea from China and arm the Saudi royalty against Yemen, and do both of those things for human rights. So I've concluded that the rule-based order is just too complex to be understood outside of the skull of Antony Blinken, and our duty should principally consist of praying in the direction of the US State Department while sending checks to the Democratic Party. The US government does not have a major political party that isn't a catastrophic scam with a good chunk of the country more or less fooled by it. The Republican Party says that wealth concentration, authoritarian power, environmental destruction, bigotry, and hatred are good for you. They are not. The Democratic Party platform and even candidate Joe Biden promised much. In place of most of those promises, people have got an off-Broadway show in which the president and most of the Congress members act out the part of being upset that a couple of their members are supposedly blocking everything they really sincerely long to do if only their hands weren't tied. This is an act, and we know it's an act for several reasons. I'll give you 6 of them. 1, the Democratic Party has a long history of preferring over successes failures that can be blamed on Republicans but please funders. When the public gave the Democrats the Congress in 2006 to end the war on Iraq, Rahm Emanuel, the current nominee for ambassador to Japan, made clear that their plan was to keep the war going in order to run against it again in 2008. He was right. I mean, he was a genocidal monster, but people blamed the Republicans for the Democrats' choice to escalate the war they had been elected to end, just as people will blame Iran for Biden's choice not to allow peace with Iran. Number 2, when party leaders want something, they have lots of carrots and sticks and do not hesitate to use them. Not one carrot or stick has been applied against Senators Manchin and Sinema. Number 3, the Senate could end the filibuster tonight if it wanted to. Number 4, President Biden has made clear his top priority of working with Republicans, despite the absence of that priority in the top demands from people and in the Democratic Party platform. Number 5, Biden could choose to take a great many actions without Congress and prefers to try but fail on Capitol Hill. And number 6, a small number of Democrats in the House of Representatives could change policy by refusing to pass legislation, an action that would require absolutely nothing of the Senate or the president, an action that could be taken by exclusively the very most heroic progressive Congress members, the extreme elite. If Republicans were to oppose a military spending bill for their own crazy reasons, such as because the bill opposes rape within the ranks or whatever, a mere 5 Democrats could vote no and block the bill or impose their terms on it. Now, I know you can get 100 House members to vote for a proposal to reduce military spending that they are sure will not pass, and for which votes they have 0 carrots and sticks used on them by their party masters. But votes that might actually accomplish something are a different story. The so-called Progressive Caucus only recently decided to have any sort of requirements at all for membership. And those requirements do not require any adherence to any particular policy positions. There's even a sort of a semi-secret so-called Defense Spending Reduction Caucus that doesn't require its members to try to prevent increased military spending. Last week, I thought that the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, Congressman Mark Pocan, had tweeted that he would vote no on increased military spending. I thanked him on Twitter. He replied by cursing at and insulting me via a number of tweets. We went back and forth a half dozen times, and he was just furious that anyone would suggest he commit to voting against something he supposedly opposes. Later, I saw Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib tweet that she would not vote for a war budget. I tweeted my thanks and my hope that she wouldn't start cursing at me as Congressman Pocan had done. After that, Pocan apologized to me and said that actually voting against the massive military spending was one of the possible approaches he was considering. He would not tell me what any of the other approaches are, but presumably they involve voting in favor of increased military spending. Of course, in years gone by, we've had several dozen Congress members commit to voting against war funding and then turn around and vote for it. But now you can't even get them to claim they'll vote against it. Nina Turner, who co-chaired Bernie Sanders' campaign, is running for Congress in Ohio. She's been on my radio show. I've been on hers. She understands the problem of military spending and war, but she has a campaign website that, like most, makes no mention of foreign policy, war, peace, treaties, bases, military spending, the overall budget, or the existence of 96% of humanity. Yesterday, by phone, her campaign manager explained to me that foreign policy was in their, quote, internal platform, and that the public platform was what people in Ohio's 11th district care about and are impacted by, as if Senator Turner believes that military spending doesn't impact people in Ohio's 11th district, and that Turner hasn't been elected yet, as if campaign websites should be developed post-election, and that there just wasn't space, as if the internet has applied a limit to websites. The campaign manager denied any other motivation and claimed that they might someday add foreign policy to their website. This was a faster and, for me, far more disappointing sellout than Senator Raphael Warnock's 180 on Palestinian rights. It's not the water in Washington that gets to these people. It is the long arm of the campaign consultants before they ever get near Washington. Some say the world will end in fire, and some say in ice. Some say nuclear apocalypse, and some say a slower demise brought on by environmental collapse. But the two are intimately connected. The wars are driven by desires to dominate dirty energy profits as well as populations. The wars and the war preparations are huge contributors to climate and environmental destruction. Money that could be used to address environmental needs is going into the poisonous militaries that devastate even the nations they are supposedly defending. In my city of Charlottesville, Virginia, we passed divestment of public dollars from both weapons and fossil fuels as a single issue. World Beyond War, and we were just discussing, some of you are already signed up. World Beyond War has a 6-week course that starts today on war and the environment. And if there are any spots left, you can grab one at worldbeyondwar.org. We also have a petition at worldbeyondwar.org/online that demands an end to the practice of excluding militarism from climate treaties and agreements. An opportunity to advance this basic demand may come with the climate summit planned for Glasgow this November. Infrastructure is on the agenda in Washington these days, at least for political theater, but without conversion and without demilitarization. Funding it is on the agenda, but without moving funds from militarism. Several nations have moved funds out of militarism explicitly to address the coronavirus pandemic. Others have doubled down. The trade-offs are obscene. Health, nutrition, and green energy could all be radically transformed globally with a fraction of US military spending. Maybe I shouldn't say this on a call to Texas, but so could livestock. The only positions I ever get excited about in US politics are the ones that Republicans pretend Democrats hold. and beef is no exception. Republicans have been pretending not just that Democrats want the usual array of things I wish someone would actually act to institute: a guaranteed income, a decent minimum wage, single-payer health care, a Green New Deal, a shift to progressive taxation, defunding militarism, making college free, the horror of it, but also that Biden is going to somehow forbid the consumption of more than a tiny bit of beef. Now, I did not suspect for even an instant that there was a grain of truth to this story. In fact, I think I first heard about it as a debunking of a false story. Yet I do wish it were true. And twisting Biden's actual promise to reduce greenhouse gas emissions into a ban on gorging on hamburgers makes more sense than might at first be evident to all McDonald's customers. Converting energy and transportation systems to green energy is critically important, in some combination with scaling back consumption. But it takes a great deal of time and investment, and then only gives you part of what you needed by yesterday. Ceasing to consume animals and dairy products and sea life, if the will existed to do it, could be done swiftly. And according to some studies, the harm done by methane and nitrous oxide is worse than that of CO2, and the benefits of reducing them more rapid. Some significant percentage of greenhouse gas emissions comes from animal agriculture, perhaps a quarter, but that seems like only a part of the story. Animal agriculture uses the vast majority of all US water consumption and nearly half of the land in the 48 contiguous states. Its waste is killing off the oceans. Its growth is deforesting the Amazon. But even that seems like only a tiny, almost irrelevant piece of that story. The fact is that the crops raised to feed animals to feed people could feed many more people if the animals were removed from the equation. People are starving to death so that the food that could have fed them 10 times over can be fed to cows to make hamburgers that can be advertised on media outlets that can report as a terrible joke that someone would restrict meat consumption. And that seems like only a small part of the problem. The other part is the brutal abuse and killing of millions of animals, and the fact that treating them slightly less brutally would mean using even more land and more time to feed even fewer people. I don't agree with Tolstoy that you can't end war without ending the slaughter of animals, but I do want to end both, and I do think either one alone may doom humanity. Sometimes the pretense by Republicans that Democrats favor something is an early good omen, and decades later, one can find actual live Democrats who do support that thing. Other times, the Republican propaganda serves to more permanently marginalize good ideas. What we need is a mechanism for widely communicating that what we want, in fact, what we urgently need, is what Republicans are screaming their opposition to. Sadly, what the actual Joe Biden values far more than the future of the planet is the friendship and the goodwill of Republicans. Substances as fictional as the Biden beef ban. Sadly as well, agriculture is almost as taboo a topic even for environmentalist groups as the environmental destruction done by militaries. There is nothing right now to stop Democrats from making a regular part of their stump speeches a passionate promise never to ban beef, alongside their denials of charges that they want to ban guns. We don't have much time left to change this. Another suddenly popular topic in corporate media is bioweapons labs. Have you noticed that a lot of science writers have lately been saying that they were perfectly right a year ago to mock and condemn even considering a lab leak origin for coronavirus, but that now it's perfectly proper to admit that coronavirus may very well have come from a lab? It seems to be largely a question of fashion. One doesn't wear the wrong outfit too early in the season or explore the wrong epidemiological idea when the White House is claimed by one party or the other. In March 2020, I blogged about how articles denouncing the possibility that the coronavirus pandemic originated with a leak from a bioweapons lab sometimes actually admitted to basic facts that made such an origin likely. The first reported outbreak was extremely close to one of the few places on Earth actively experimenting with weaponizing coronavirus, but a huge distance from the supposed source in bats. Not only had various labs had leaks before, but scientists had recently warned of the danger of leaks from that lab. There was a theory about a seafood market, and the fact that this theory fell apart seems not to have entered the public consciousness to the same extent as the false fact that it supposedly disproved the lab leak theory. I was, by March 2020, very used to the stopped clock problem. Just as even a stopped clock is right twice a day, a bunch of Trump-worshiping China haters could be right about the origins of a pandemic. Certainly, what they were raving about provided absolutely zero evidence against their claims happening to be correct, just as Trump being depicted as anti-NATO was not actually a good reason for me to start loving NATO. I did not think the lab leak possibility risked providing any good reason to actually hate China. I knew that Anthony Fauci and the US government invested in that lab. If the insanely unjustifiable risks taken by that lab were an excuse to hate anything, the objects of that hatred couldn't be limited to China. And if China is a military threat, why fund its bioweapons research? I was also very used to censorship surrounding the whole topic of bioweapons. You're not supposed to talk about the overwhelming evidence that the spread of Lyme disease was thanks to a US bioweapons lab, or the likelihood that the US government's view is correct, that the 2001 anthrax attacks originated with material from a US bioweapons lab. So I didn't take condemnation of even considering the lab leak theory for coronavirus as meriting compliance. If anything, the stigma being attached to the lab leak theory made me suspect it was right, or at least that bioweapons makers wanted to hide the fact that a lab leak was quite plausible. In my view, the plausibility of that, even if never proven, was a new good reason to shut down all the world's bioweapons labs. I was pleased to see Sam Husseini and a very few others pursue the question with open minds. Corporate media outlets did no such thing. Just as you can't oppose a looming war or step outside the prescribed limits of debate on numerous topics, you could not for a year or more say certain things about coronavirus in US corporate media. Now writers tell us that the impossibility of a lab origin was just their knee-jerk reaction. But why should a knee-jerk reaction count for anything? And groupthink doesn't actually depend on somebody's knee-jerk reaction. Even if that memory is accurate, it depends on editors enforcing prohibitions. Now, writers tell us that they chose to believe scientists rather than Trumpsters. But the reality was also that they chose to believe the CIA and related agencies rather than Trumpsters. The scientific dubiousness of placing faith in the statements of professional liars notwithstanding. The reality is also that they chose to obey decrees published in scientific-ish publications without even questioning the motivations. A super serious letter published by The Lancet said, quote, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." Not to disprove, not to disagree with, not to offer evidence against, but to condemn, and not merely to condemn, but to stigmatize as evil and irrational conspiracy theories. But the organizer of that letter, Peter Daszak, had funded at the Wuhan lab just the research that could have resulted in the pandemic. This massive conflict of interest was not a problem for The Lancet, for major media outlets. The Lancet even put Daszak on a commission to study the origin question, as did the World Health Organization. I don't know where the pandemic came from any more than I know who shot John F. Kennedy on that street in Dallas, but I do know that you wouldn't have put Alan Dulles on a commission to study Kennedy if even appearing to care about the truth had been a top priority. And I know that Daszak investigating himself and finding himself absolutely blameless is a cause for suspicion, not credulity. And no, I do not want the CIA investigating this or anything else or existing at all. Any such investigation has a 100% chance of being done in bad faith, but a 50% chance of reaching the right conclusion. What difference does it make where a pandemic came from? Well, if it came from the tiny remnants of wild nature left on Earth, a possible solution might be to cease destruction and deforestation, perhaps even abolish livestock and restore huge areas of land to the wild. But another possible solution, and one guaranteed to be pursued with fervor in the absence of massive pushback, would be to research, investigate, experiment. In other words, invest still more in weapons labs to fend off further assaults on innocent little humanity. If, on the other hand, the origin were proven to be a weapons lab, and you could make this argument based just on the possibility that it's a weapons lab, then a solution might be to shut the damn things down. The incredible diversion of resources into militarism is a leading cause of environmental destruction, the reason for the risk of nuclear apocalypse, and quite possibly the reason not just for poor investment in medical preparedness, but also directly for the disease that has ravaged the globe during this past year. There might be increased basis for questioning the madness of militarism. Regardless of what, if anything, we manage to learn further about the origins of the pandemic, we do know that questioning corporate media is in order. If objective reporting on matters of science is basically subject to fashion trends, how much faith should we put in assertions about economics or diplomacy? Of course, the media may instruct you not to think something that also happens to be completely false. But if I were you, I'd keep my eyes peeled for overeager dictates on what not to think. Often those will tell you exactly what you might want to look into. One thing you're not to think is that war is objectionable. The ACLU today is pushing for young women to be compelled against their will to kill and die for weapons profits. The unfairness to women of compelling only young men to register for the draft is the problem. War is a normal and inevitable feature of the rule-based order. What we need to do is to make war objectionable. One way to do this, I think, laid out by the admirable work of the Black Lives Matter movement, is to get the videos of the victims, to do disruptive protests, to force the videos into the corporate media, and to demand action. Let's work on that together. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was beautifully done and well said, and I very much appreciate what you've said. Well, before we get to the questions, we don't have many, so please load them up. I want to make sure to thank Nick Hernandez, who has done the technical support tonight, and also wanted to say something about the North Texas Peace Activists. It's a super small group of seasoned peace activists who recently constituted and are currently meeting 2 times a month. And so that's and Aftab Siddiqui is the president or chairperson of this mostly pretty informal group as of yet. So now we'll go to the questions. David, I don't think this question is for you, but maybe it is for Nick Hernandez. Are we going to be able to translate the recording into some sort of transcript so that people can get this excellent presentation in writing?
In writing, I'm not sure. However, I can.
I am.
I can figure it out. We're also live on Facebook, and I know there's a feature there on Facebook where you can do that. So I don't know. I'll get the answer for whomever asked that. And yeah, thank you for your question.
Donald, might I take a crack at that one?
Sure.
So I wrote it and read it, and I'll put it on my website and 10 other websites, and you can get it from there. It'll be at swanson.org and worldbeyondwar.org and so forth and so on. So I don't think that we need to go through the process of me reading it and then someone transcribing it when it's already written down.
Great. Will Thomas says, ask, how can we the people overcome the money and the political power of lobbyists of the military, industrial, congressional, media, university, petroleum complex?
Oh, you left out 18 things. Yeah. Well, I don't know if we can or we can't. I know we sometimes do and we sometimes don't. I know that, public pressure called off the carpet bombing of Syria several years ago when Obama was president. I know that public pressure helped create that temporary non-treaty Iran agreement that's now gone by the wayside. I know that public pressure has helped prevent an attack on Iran 3 or 4 times when it was close over the years. I know that even in this new government in Washington, peace activists have had a little bit of influence. We've stopped some of the worst nominations. Michelle Flournoy for Secretary of so-called Defense would have been far worse than what we got. We've managed with concerted effort to raise all of our voices together strategically and have some smidgen of influence. And I think as you go to the international level or other countries or the state or the local level, you can have vastly more influence more easily. So do some local campaigns that feed people's burning need for successes, and then focus on the national government that's so hard. But I think, and World Beyond War does this. We do divestment campaigns. We get local cities and universities and institutions to take funding out of weapons of war, which is an educational process. You have conversations about why it shouldn't be acceptable to have money in there. And we organize around, particular local and state issues, and then get people working on, what's needed in Washington. And I think there is the possibility now of broader discussion of the horror of giving billions of dollars to the Israeli government, and oh, by the way, almost every other government on earth, for them to buy weapons for their horrible militaries. And I think there is the possibility of working on this problem, of trying to get 5 Democrats in the House of Representatives to swear they will vote no on military funding unless there's a significant decrease. You've got 100 of them who swore last year that they were for cutting by 10% and taking that 10% and putting it to good use somewhere. If we can't get 5 or 6 or 8 of them to swear they're willing to vote no on increasing it when they're supposedly for decreasing it by 10%, then we've got a real problem.
You, Gray Southern says, what do we know about nations, how nations can work together that does not require military power?
What do we know about it? Well, we know more all the time. My colleagues at World Beyond War have put together a book called A Global Security System, an Alternative to War, which I recommend. We know that nations, for the most part, work together without violence. We know what's needed to reform or replace the United Nations, to democratize it, to bring more parties into it. We know what it takes to create a new treaty and bring nations on board. We know what it takes to push the International Criminal Court or national courts in other countries to take action against horrible wars and war crimes. I think we need vastly more of nations working without violence, and we need to, get rid of this idea that military agreements like NATO are somehow the only way that nations can work together, when nations can and must and do work together on such matters as slowing the collapse of the climate and trade and travel and immigration and so forth. So, there's this crazy. Sheila is holding up the book, A Global Security System, if you want to see what the cover looks like. I think there's this bizarre idea that, you know, when there's a proposal for a war, we must do something, which means have a war or do nothing. You know, but if you're against NATO, you know, which is literally a requirement that your country join in any war that a growing list now of dozens of countries, you know, gets itself into. You know, this is madness. I mean, England and France a couple weeks ago both sent warships to threaten each other over a little island called Jersey. If they had gone to war, you know, that would have required every member of NATO to attack both France and England and anyone else who attacked either France or England, right? You know, this sort of stupidity is not the only way that nations can work together. You know, and basic treaties on fundamental human rights for various groups and interests don't need to be invented by the United States when almost the entire rest of the world is already party to them, and the United States is an outlier. I think there is one country on earth that hasn't joined the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, and it's a country that likes to, you know, promote militarism and recruit children and sentence children to life in prison and various things that you shouldn't do under that treaty. But, you know, the answer to a lot of things can be learned by looking at other countries that are already doing them. You know, if you want to know how you could do healthcare better, look at every other wealthy country on earth almost, and they're doing healthcare better. You know, so I think there's a lot to be gained by becoming a global community and learning from each other globally.
Thank you. David and Jan Hartzell, they ask, what do you see as hopeful signs that we can end war before the war the war ends us? What are the hopeful ways all of us can get involved in ending wars?
I should mention, for those who don't know, that David Hartsoe had the idea for World Beyond War and co-founded it with me and wrote the incredible book, Waging Peace. And I hate to disappoint him and the rest of you, but I don't have any hopeful signs for you. And my advice, which will be heeded by none of you, is to stop worrying about trying to be hopeful and paying any attention to whether you should be hopeful or despairing. I don't have time for either one. I find it much more enjoyable to do what I think we have a moral duty to do, succeed or not, and do it as strategically as possible. Now, of course, that as strategically as possible requires giving everybody signs of hope and success, because they all love that stuff and it gets them involved. And so I'm contradicting myself, right? So, you know, again, if a war starts, we have endless news coverage and it goes in the history books and we're denounced as failures. But when a war is prevented, it's immediately forgotten. There's never going to be a day on anybody's calendar to celebrate the time we prevented a war on Iran or we prevented the bombing of Syria. It's never going to happen, right? And so we do have to constantly point out to each other when we accomplish things, large and small. You know, we just this week are getting a horrible monument that glorifies genocide taken down at the University of Virginia, and coming up with some ideas for some public monuments we could actually be proud of. You know, and doing these things locally encourages people. We also, you know, have just seen another horrific bombing of the people of Gaza by the Israeli military, and seen, you know, the vast majority of the discussion of it horrendously barbaric and biased. But if you want the glass half full part, we've also seen much more positive, honest coverage and discussion and humanization, as they call it, of the humans who live in Palestine. in US corporate media and even in the US Congress, and even saw resolutions for the first time in history introduced in both houses of the US Congress opposing a particular weapons sale to the Israeli government. And so there's not a complete absence of movement. It's a question of whether we can increase the momentum, accelerate the movement before it's too late. And when you work globally and you work with people who are stopping the construction of military bases, preventing NATO bases from even putting one shovel in the ground, shutting down weapons systems, stopping weapons purchases, blocking weapons shipments with their bodies and with their lobbying. This is one of the benefits of working in a global organization. The successes are mostly happening on some other corner of the globe, but you can get people together, as we did the past 3 days with World Beyond War's annual conference, and talk about a few of those successes and what's worked for others, so you can try them locally. And there's never the absence of activism and activist successes that you would think from reading a newspaper or watching a TV.
Anson Nader says, David, you mentioned making war objectionable again. The United States has a long history of objecting to warring, albeit existing in relation to groups that hunger for it. You are likely familiar with the conscientious objection. Do you think this concept idea has some potential for expansion into the sphere of anti-militarism activism, specifically for those people who are not necessarily service members?
Well, again, I don't believe it's a service to anyone to join in a mass killing operation. I think the U.S. military's current seeking of a contract for an outside firm to identify the extremists in its ranks is a bit bizarre, in that every single person in its ranks is willing to engage in a mass killing program. What is more extreme than that? I don't know. But I certainly think that conscientious objection has enormous potential and has already done enormous good, and that we ought to annually celebrate the holiday that is dedicated to conscientious objectors. We ought to have more monuments, as they have some good ones in England and elsewhere, to conscientious objection. We ought to remind the ACLU, which had such a misguided comment today about the Supreme Court's ruling on draft registration, or rather refusal to take up a case on draft registration, of its roots in supporting objection to World War I. I wrote a book recently. I said in my remarks about World War II, I noted in there the incredible work of the conscientious objectors to World War II, who essentially kick-started the US civil rights movement from within the prisons during that war. And I do think that we ought to expand the definition of conscientious objection beyond just what members of a military can do, or recruits in a military draft can do. We can all refuse and help young people refuse to register for drafts, and to register instead as conscientious objectors, and to go on record as being conscientious objectors when required to register for a draft. And there are lots of great organizations, I'm sure you know, many of them that work on this issue. And the Center on Conscience and War was quoted in a recent remarkably good article about conscientious objection in the New York Times, of all places. And we ought to do everything we can to support these efforts.
Todd Siddiqui says, how do you perceive the role of the United Nations so far? Are you in favor of making it stronger?
I guess that would depend a little on what stronger means. The United States accepted the United Nations where it didn't accept the League of Nations, I think, first and foremost because it got special status more equal than others. And it has now surpassed the Soviet Union as the greatest abuser of the veto power in the United Nations. If you're going to set up an organization that's going to be global and that's going to try to rid the world of the scourge of war, and you're going to make its members be precisely those entities that engage in war, and then you're going to give special privileges to block anything to 5 of the biggest war makers and weapons dealers, then you've got a certain amount of good intentions combined with a certain amount of snafu misdesign in your process. I'm certainly in favor of democratizing the United Nations, of getting rid of the veto, of empowering the General Assembly. I've designed, and World Beyond War is designed, and various great people have drafted contest entries, on what a reformed organization to replace the United Nations might look like, without denying for a second that the United Nations is what we've got at the moment, and we ought to try to put it to good use, not bad use, and reform and improve it. I would love to see the International Criminal Court for Africa really become an international criminal court for the world, so that powerful countries could be prosecuted, individuals in powerful countries could be prosecuted for their crimes, and then the Court of Justice as well. But, they're under the thumb of this biased institution in the United Nations. When it comes to strengthening the United Nations, that could mean some very, very good things. It could also mean some very, very bad things. The United Nations has the second biggest armed military on the planet. I don't want to strengthen it. I want to abolish it. I want to move the United Nations toward far greater use of unarmed peacekeepers, something that David Hartsoe and others on this call could speak about more than myself.
Joyce Hall says, ask, you said the Democrats could stop the filibuster immediately. How do you do that if you can't get the votes, even 51?
Yeah, well, you can get the votes. For one thing, the other day, there were a dozen or more Republicans out of town, and the Democrats, all but 1 or 2 of them, and one of them you wanted to have out of town, sitting there on Capitol Hill. And there were people, even media outlets, screaming, "Do it now, go ahead and do it now." And of course they wouldn't. But again, as I said in my remarks, when the party leaders want something, they'll offer committee positions, committee chairs, bills brought to the floor, factories of all varieties to be built in your district. They'll threaten money for a challenger, primarying, support for redistricting. They will threaten your career, and they have the power to make it or break it. They'll, when my friend and much admired great former Congressman Dennis Kucinich was refusing to go along with Obamacare, thought we should have single payer. I don't know what Obama said to him when he gave him a ride on his presidential airplane, but they won him over. They won him over through some combination of threats and inducements. There has not been a single. It is very clear. It's not even not that we know of. It's clear there has not been a single threat or inducement. The other day, last week, President Biden happened to just mention the existence of Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, not even by name, I think. And it was this huge story. The White House changes tack, is cracking down on these 2 senators. No, he mentioned that they existed. That was the extent of it. If they wanted to get rid of the filibuster, the advice from a parliamentarian on Capitol Hill means nothing. It would certainly mean nothing to the Republicans. If they wanted to do it, they would do it. There is clearly far more interest in keeping it and blaming it, just like keeping the Iraq War going and blaming it, than there is in getting rid of it. If they wanted to get rid of it, they would get rid of it.
Mark Van Geese commented that May 15th was International Day of Conscientious Objection.
Thank you. I didn't remember the date, but we should mark it every year.
We're getting close to the end of that's the end of the comment section. I want to thank David Swanson for incredible, insightful, and interesting, and entertaining, and informative. Thank you. I'd like to give our president, Aftab Siddiqui, the last words.
Thank you very much, Don. David, thank you so much for being here and spending time with us. You have given us incredible points on our efforts towards ending the war and towards uplifting the peace efforts at the local as well as the international issues. And on behalf of the North Texas Peace Advocates, I thank you for your words, for your time, for your energy, and for your wisdom. Thank you so much. And if we want to contribute to your organization, where would we go for any information and contribution? And I would really like to inform everybody to please look at the website and sign in the petition if there are any, and do join the educational forums that they are offering if it's possible and convenient. So where can we go to really help you out and join in your efforts, David?
Thank you very, very much. Worldbeyondwar.org is the most relevant organization I work for. My personal website is davidswanson.org. I also work at rootsaction.org and involved with lots of other groups. If you go to worldbeyondwar.org, you can sign a peace pledge that's been signed in 191 countries. You can make your organization an affiliate. If it isn't, you can start a chapter. You can join individually in various campaigns or online courses. You can volunteer in various ways. You can donate if you want to support in that way by clicking on donate. And we're very grateful for anything anybody wants to do to be involved.
I want to thank everybody for participating.
Yeah, I would really like to, Don, let me thank everybody. I see so many new faces here. I would really like to thank everybody who came in here and spent some time with us. And I would really like to inform everybody that North Texas Peace Advocates will be holding similar kind of sessions with activists and community leaders, and every first Monday of the month, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. Central Time. So please do join us and contribute towards peace. And Don, go ahead, please. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank everybody for participating, especially David Swanson. Very, very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.